Welcome to Mormon Book Reviews, where an evangelical encounters the restoration. I'm your host, Steven Pynakker, and folks, I have to tell you, I just finished this book yesterday. This thing is a page turner, and I am honored to have the author of this book, Romney: A Reckoning, McKay Coppins. Welcome to the show today.
Hey, thanks for having me. I'm happy to do it.
And just really, I just want to let you know, folks, like, look, you guys, you all know I'm a real geek, right? And of course, I have the Atlantic article you wrote. Oh, this is going on 3 years ago, dude. This is before I even had my first episode, and I'm reading this article. And you are really a great writer, and you have a Latter-day Saint background. And what makes this story so unique, folks, is I didn't realize this until I read the book, that I had heard that you were given access to Romney's journals. And so, and of course, Mitt Romney does extensive journaling, which is fascinating because you get an insight. And then also you had 45 interviews with Mitt Romney. So this is really Romney's story. Now, you say there's a few things he quibbles with, but generally speaking, he likes the book. And I just wanted to ask you, before we get started in the interview, what was it like for you to be able to engage somebody like Mitt Romney, and was it surprising to you that basically he gets to the point where he's getting a crowbar trying to get one of the filing cabinets open? To somebody who's just somebody he kind of knew, to actually have an intimate friendship with him, what was that like?
I was surprised that he went for it at all, to be honest, because my pitch to him when I approached him about writing this book, this was my idea. It was basically, I want to write an authorized I want to write a biography where I get all the access that I would from an authorized biography, right? But without giving up editorial control. So, I'll let you read it before it's published, but I get to decide what goes in it. You don't have veto power. And that's kind of an enormous amount of control for a sitting politician to give up to a writer. And a lot of people who know a little about our backgrounds assume that I have this really old, long, relationship with him. And the truth is, I don't. I first met him in person when he arrived in the Senate in 2019. I had covered his presidential campaign, but never interviewed him. So it was interesting. I thought that he would balk at the terms that I had proposed for this book. And instead, he almost kind of received them as a dare. Like I think he sensed my implicit suggestion that he might not be willing to be fully candid, and kind of countered by saying, I'm going to set aside an evening every week that I'm in Washington to meet with you. I'm going to give you my journals without your even asking. I'm going to, like you said, take a crowbar to a locked filing cabinet in my home office and just deposit the contents on your lap and kind of let you sort through them. And so that was the level of disclosure that he brought to the project. And then it was kind of up to me to take all of this material, hundreds of pages of his journals, hundreds, if not thousands of personal emails, text messages, and then, hours and hours and hours of interviews, and figure out what the story was there. And it was really kind of interesting for me because I had covered his presidential campaign. I'd really been writing about him from a distance for more than a decade as a journalist. And so to suddenly have so much access, not just to him, but to his kind of most private thoughts at various points in his life and political career, was really interesting. I mean, just think about like a public figure that you're most interested in. And you probably often wondered, like, I wonder what they're thinking right now. I wonder I wonder how this experience was from the inside, right? And all of a sudden I had access to all of it. So it was both exciting, kind of like thrilling, but also sort of daunting to try to figure out, how do I turn this all into a book, and a book that I was happy to hear that you called it a page turner, because from the very beginning, my editor and I kind of made the decision that we didn't want this to be an encyclopedic chronicle of every moment of Mitt Romney's life, because there are biographies that are 800, 900 pages long. I wanted this to feel like a story, like a novel, and so that meant leaving a lot on the cutting room floor to make it kind of a compelling read.
And I'm glad that you did that, because I have to tell you, and I've mentioned this publicly, is that I've always had a certain degree of ambivalence about Mitt Romney. Now, I'll just give you just some background. I was a political consultant back in the day. I was involved with the college Republicans. I ran for political office myself. So I've been I'm a political animal most of my life, and I always felt like I remember his Senate campaign against Ted Kennedy in '94, and of course that was the year of the Republican Revolution with Newt Gingrich, and Romney didn't. It looked like for a while that Romney had a legit shot at knocking Ted Kennedy
Yeah.
off. And but Ted, he was still had his fastball, and that's really what caused him not to win. But then he learned a lot of lessons from his senatorial campaign. And then he, of course, you talk about the Winter Olympics and that opportunity, and that kind of propelled him on the national stage as being somebody who could either run as a Democrat in Utah for governor or a Republican gubernatorial candidate in Massachusetts. And he kind of had his choice of what direction he wanted to go. And it's an interesting guy because I always felt like he's kind of inaccessible as like an evangelical Christian from the Midwest.
Yeah.
He feels like, I always felt like he never quite connected with people like a lot of politicians do. He does, and I will tell you, my grandfather loved his father. My grandfather lived in Michigan. I come from a long line of Dutch Reformed Calvinists, but my grandfather was one of those rare Roosevelt Democrats, and but he
Interesting.
loved his father very much, so he did a great job. But Romney seems like an enigma. And after reading this book, I feel like I got to know the man. And for you, you got to know the man even in an even more intimate way. Maybe talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, well, I mean that was the thing about covering him as a presidential candidate. Like I was just a reporter on the campaign trail in 2012, and I have to say, like, the thing that was frustrating about it was that he was so cautious and so calculating and so kind of determined to stick to his talking points all the time. I mean, I heard the same stump speech probably 300 times, right? I had memorized it by the end of the campaign. And it felt like there was always a question. And I remember like reporters on the campaign trail would often debate this question because I remember like we would sometimes wonder like what do you think he's really thinking, like what's going on beneath the surface. And some reporters, I remember one reporter telling me, I actually don't think Mitt Romney has very much much of an interior life. Like I think he actually isn't thinking that much. I think it's all what you see is what you get. And I thought that was plausible, but I always kind of sensed that wasn't true. I always sensed that there was more to the man than what we were getting as a political persona. And as it turns out, going through his journals, especially, what it revealed was that he actually has a very kind of robust interior life. He's extremely introspective. He's incredibly hard on himself. Throughout his presidential campaign, when he was keeping really detailed journals, he would often kind of, use those journals to vent about his political opponents, his consultants, his campaign staff, but more than anything, himself. Like he would castigate himself for the gaffes he was committing on the campaign trail, or, why can't I connect with people? Why can't I communicate the things that I want to communicate? Why do people not see me the way that I am? Like he really wrestled with this stuff as a candidate. And I think that was a revelation to me. I don't think most people just watching him on the campaign trail would get the sense that he was like that, right? Like you kind of would assume that he was this kind of really confident, rich, maybe kind of out of touch guy who thought that he was pretty great. The reality is he was very conflicted about whether he even wanted to be president, whether he wanted this job. I think it was really revealing to spend time in his journals that way because he does spend a lot of time ruminating about his weaknesses as a politician and as a man.
So I wanted to talk about, as an evangelical Christian, you talk pretty extensively about his engagements when he was running for office, especially for president, for both his presidential campaigns. And because basically the evangelicals have essentially taken over the Republican Party.
Mm-hmm.
And let's just be honest, folks, one of the reasons why Romney lost when he got the Republican nomination is that there were hundreds of thousands of evangelicals that stayed home in states like Ohio that didn't vote for him. And that's the reality of the situation. There's an underlying bigotry against Latter-day Saints in the evangelical community. We have had over 200 years now of our two camps fighting each other.
Yeah.
Literally in the 19th century, we were killing each other, right? Mm-hmm. And so we have this long history. And I was disappointed, but not surprised by the treatment that he received by evangelicals, in that Franklin Graham, criticized him for appointing gay people into the courts. And then you had Robert Jeffries, that guy out of Dallas, who's I mean, oh gosh, I can't stand the guy. And then but what's interesting, you didn't cover this in the book, but I wanted to ask you, what I did find interesting was Bob Jones did endorse Mitt Romney.
Yeah.
And maybe just talk about like that. That's an interesting story that you don't cover in the book, but maybe just talk a little bit about that, but also talk about Mitt's general engagement with evangelicals as well, both good and bad.
Right. I mean, so he ran for president twice, right? And the first time in 2008, he had positioned himself as the kind of more right wing of the candidates, because the other front runners at the time when he entered the race were Rudy Giuliani, who is a fairly liberal Republican out of New York at the time, who was pretty moderate to liberal on a bunch of social issues, and then John McCain, who was also seen as kind of a centrist candidate. And so he kind of, the path he saw was leaning into kind of the conservative culture warrior persona, right? And so he tried to outflank John McCain and Rudy Giuliani and other candidates on issues like immigration and abortion. And he thought of himself as, or he presented himself at least as this kind of candidate for conservatives. But what that meant was that he had to spend a lot of time in Iowa and a lot of time courting evangelical voters and power brokers, especially, right? And I write in the book, and you were referencing this, about a meeting early on he had at his home in Belmont, where they had gathered, a bunch of kind of luminaries of the religious right. You mentioned Graham. I can't remember the others. There were a handful of them, but
Jerry Falwell was
Jerry
in.
Jerry Falwell Senior, I
Yeah.
believe, right? Yeah, and he actually liked Falwell. It was interesting. He liked Falwell Senior, but the others kind of, he thought that this would kind of be a friendly get to know you, meeting. And instead, it sort of turned into like a grand inquisition, where it was like it started out as these guys kind of pressing him on political and policy issues. Why did you appoint gay judges to the bench as governor of Massachusetts? And what about your flip-flopping on abortion and things like that? But as the conversation progressed, Romney started to get the sense that their concerns weren't really political, they were theological, right? They just didn't like his Mormonism. And eventually the rubber hit the road, and that kind of came to the fore. And once that was the conversation, it devolved into a debate about the nature of God and, other theological differences. And at the end of it, it's funny, they all left, and Mitt's campaign consultants thought that it had gone really well. They were like, oh, this went great. But Romney sensed it, because he had spent his life as a Mormon who understood the tensions between evangelicals and Mormons better than a lot of his more secular campaign consultants, kind of sensed like this is not going to go great. And that basically bore out, right? I mean, I tell story after story of that 2008 Republican primary where he was constantly running into anti-Mormon sentiment from evangelical leaders. There's one story I write about where he is in South Carolina with a group of faith leaders, and a minister who's there says, "Look, I want to just stop you right here. You seem like a nice guy. I agree with a lot of the stuff you're saying, but I will never vote for you, because if you're elected president, more people will go to hell." And Romney was sort of taken aback by that, and kind of said, "Well, why?" And the guy said, "Look, if we have a Mormon president, more people will become Mormons, and those people will go to hell. So if I were to endorse you, I would essentially be endorsing people going to hell." And so when it was framed like that for Romney, it kind of became clear to him just how much of an uphill battle he had to win over these evangelical leaders. And I think it was hard for him, because Romney felt like, from a values perspective and from a personal perspective, the way he'd led his personal life, his family, he should have been the candidate of conservative religious voters. But a lot of them just couldn't get past the fact that he was Mormon, and it did hurt him in both 2008 and 2012.
Yes, it did. It did. You know, it reminds me so much of, actually, I tell people one of the places that Mormonism was birthed at was at Alvin's funeral, when the Presbyterian minister says that Alvin's burning in hell.
Yep.
And so this has been the underlying tension for 200 plus years between the evangelicalism and the Restoration. And so that pastor is basically just saying the exact same thing that that pastor said to the Smith family at Alvin's funeral. And
Well,
it's one of
and
the great tragedies.
can I just want to jump in here though, because one thing I will say about this is like, I remember having a conversation actually with an editor at The Atlantic at one point who was talking about the religious beliefs he grew up with. And he was saying, you know, we can all have these ecumenical conversations and be kind to each other, but when you get to beliefs in the afterlife and judgment, like that's where the rubber hits the road. And like that's where people have to get real with each other. And it leads to some very uncomfortable conversations because different sects have different beliefs about, you know, there are plenty of universalists and people who believe everybody will be saved. But like the reality is like Mormons and evangelicals actually do have a lot of very profound theological differences. And so I'm not saying that those are, you know, not allowed to exist, right? Like it's fine. I think that the frustration for Mitt Romney was, you know, not to jump ahead too much, was after 2012 failing to win over the kind of a lot of evangelical conservative voters, seeing those same people rally around Donald Trump so enthusiastically, and his ability to garner so much support from white evangelicals where Mitt Romney struggled. I think that was sort of the thing that hurt the most for him, because it was just the hypocrisy of saying, I can't vote for a God-fearing family man Mormon, but I will vote for Donald Trump with all the baggage that he brings and all, you know, everything we know about his personal life. I think that kind of exposed the root of the aversion to Romney and on the religious right.
You know, what's so fascinating to me is, you know, Mitt is a very practical person when it comes to his faith. And people even ask me, like, what does Mitt think about the end of days and all this kind of stuff? You know, because I put some stuff out there online to see if what kind of questions people might have for you. And what I found so interesting is, one, actually, it's what's fascinating to me is in 2012, Pat Robertson calls Romney and says that that God told him that he was going to be elected president. Then you have another story where Glenn Beck brings a Bible and a Book of Mormon to a luncheon with him, starts crying, and Mitt goes and saying that, you know, I think, you know, this is the thing. In 2010, we have to keep this in mind too, folks. In between 2008 and 2012, there was the Tea Party movement in 2010, which fundamentally changed the Republican Party. It shifted it in a way that really, honestly, you know, it's kind of a tragedy reading this book because you know how things ended up.
Mm-hmm.
And when you read it, it's like, oh, nobody saw it coming. But when you read it, it's like we should have seen it coming. In retrospect, you could see it coming, you know. But you have this real radical shift in the Republican Party. I remember, now this is when I was in my atheist time, okay? So I was an atheist for like 12 years, right? And I remember watching the news and seeing Glenn Beck in 2010 having that huge rally. And I thought to myself, oh, he thinks he's going to be fulfilling the white horse prophecy.
Yep. Yep.
This Constitution's literally hanging by a thread, and the Latter-day Saints are going to rush in and save the Republic. And I really think that Glenn Beck was absolutely convinced that that was the role that he was to play. Then we fast forward to 2012, and now he's basically believing in this kind of like, we're living in the last days. And Mitt goes to his aide and says, never again. He mouths it, never again. Like he doesn't.
Yeah.
It seems like Mitt's really uncomfortable with all this stuff, keeping in mind, of course, that the name of the church is the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe just talk about Mitt's relationship with his faith, politics, and how people would, offer, do prophetic stuff, which of course is steeped in the Latter-day Saint tradition as well. You just speak to that.
Yeah, so it's interesting. He, first of all, I should say, takes his faith very seriously. He is an Orthodox believer, in most respects. You know, like, he is a very religious man. It shapes every part of him. But he, I think, you know, and here let me speculate a little bit, just as somebody who's gotten to know him a lot, spent time reading his journals, talked to him about some of this stuff. I think he's uncomfortable with the intertwining of faith and politics, both personally and in general. And I think part of that is probably rooted in his experience with the religious right and his struggle to win those voters over. But I think also part of it is like, when he ran in 2012, you mentioned the white horse prophecy. He would have people come up to him all the time saying, oh, you're the fulfillment of the white horse prophecy. You're going to win. You're going to save this country. Obama's, destroying the Constitution. You're going to be the fulfillment of it. And he always shut it down. He would just say, no, 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 no. Like, I don't think so. I don't know about that. He actually doesn't believe in the white horse prophecy. He doesn't believe that is, believes that it was apocryphal, that it wasn't actually said by Joseph Smith. The church, of course, has disavowed it. But he also would push back when somebody like Pat Robertson would say that, right? When Pat Robertson called him and said, God told me you're going to be elected president, he wrote in his journal, I think that night or the next day, well, like God hasn't told me anything, like I haven't gotten any revelations like that. And so when you say he's practical about his faith, maybe that's it. But I think it's more that like he embraces the mystery of faith and God's, actions. Like I asked him at one point, how much do you believe God intervenes in the affairs of man? Because he said, I don't really know if God cares who wins presidential elections or that he guides the results of presidential elections. But I said, well, how much do you think he does intervene in the affairs of man? And he said, I think that's one of the great imponderables of life. That was his quote. And I put that in there because I thought it was interesting. Like, I think he genuinely doesn't know. And he has felt at times like he was guided by providence in his career, but he's also reluctant to embrace the idea that God is kind of powering his career because I think in part because he knows that that can lead to all kinds of grandiosity and bad behavior by political leaders, but also I think it might be partly a defense mechanism because he had seen his own dad, who ran for president, George Romney, who was governor of Michigan, ran for president, feel like God was leading him to the presidency, and then his campaign collapsed, and that made it even harder to deal with defeat. I think he similarly has been sort of, reluctant to let himself believe that God is placing him in certain, places. He really never believed as a presidential candidate. And some people would say that this was actually a weakness of his, but he wasn't one of these guys that believed that destiny was, conspiring to place him in the Oval Office. Like he just didn't see things that way. And maybe to become president, you do. Maybe you need that. Like maybe I have one of the books behind me, What It Takes, kind of a famous chronicle of, I believe, the 1988 presidential election. But the premise of that book is kind of looking at what it takes to believe that you should be the leader of the free world, right? And maybe that does require a certain amount of hubris and grandiosity, and maybe Mitt Romney didn't quite have enough of it. But he really didn't ever believe that God wanted him to be president.
Did you ever have a conversation with him about the very first Latter-day Saint presidential candidate, Joseph Smith, and his presidential campaign? Because I find it interesting that his church is steeped in this idea that we're living in the last days, that God does talk to prophets, talks to people, and that their founding prophet ran for president under the with the idea of a theodemocracy platform. In some ways, was actually a pretty progressive platform. Did you ever have a conversation about?
He wanted to abolish prisons and
Yeah.
buy back the all enslaved people and set them free. Yeah, I mean, I'm trying to think if we talked about Joseph. I don't think we ever did talk about Joseph Smith's presidential campaign. Joseph Smith would come up in conversations, of course. Um, but I mean, in a way, those were like you almost couldn't imagine two different Mormon presidential campaigns than Joseph Smith's and Mitt Romney's, right? Joseph Smith was running, depending on what historians you talk to, some would say that he actually did think that he could, become president. Others thought that he was trying to be sort of running a protest bid to draw attention to the plight of the Mormons. But in any case, he was running this kind of very idealistic, quixotic campaign, whereas Mitt Romney was running arguably the most practical campaign designed to actually win, right? But yeah, no, we didn't really talk about it. But I find Joseph Smith's campaign fascinating. I think that it's one of the most interesting chapters and frankly underexplored chapters of Mormon history.
That's very true. I almost wore my Joseph Smith for President T-shirt instead of the Coug shirt, uh, which you can get at the Red Brick store by the Community of Christ in Nauvoo, Illinois. So let's shout out to my homies at the Community of Christ. Love you all. So yeah, this is Mitt is such I really have to say, like I said, when I read the book, I kind of got a better understanding of the man, and I do feel like he has personal integrity. I feel like he's just a good man, and I just almost I read this book and I just feel like almost heartbroken what could have been.
Hmm.
To see where we've gone again, folks, you know me, I try to stay apolitical in this show, but this country's a mess. We're spiraling, and it just makes you wonder if Mitt had become president at some point, maybe he would have gotten elected in 2008 or 2012, or he decided to run in 2016. If Mitt had been elected president, I really do think the trajectory changes immensely. That's just me speculating, but I find it so sad because it's just to see where this country's gone and see the division, and then the guy is like now he's being pushed out. Like when you think about here is the standard bearer of the party in 2012, and odds are he probably wouldn't have won the Republican primary next year because of all the animosity directed towards him because since January 6th and everything like that. Maybe just talk about this story, just the transition of the Republican Party and Mitt's relationship with it.
Yeah, I mean that arc is the thing that kind of the whole book hinges on, right? That and that was sort of what I pitched to publishers when I wanted to do the book. Like the thing that makes him such a compelling political figure in the 21st century is that within basically a space of 10 years, he has gone from standard bearer of the Republican Party, presidential nominee, to essentially a pariah in the GOP, right? I mean, people hate him. Like the base of the party sees him as a villain. If you see Mitt Romney mentioned on Fox News, it most likely is a segment ridiculing him, attacking him, presenting him as some kind of, Benedict Arnold of the GOP. Um, and that's pretty remarkable because he remains a, pretty conservative guy on a lot of issues, on fiscal issues, even on immigration. He is stuck to his conservative positions, but the Republican Party has changed so much around him, right? And in the Trump era, especially, the GOP sort of didn't tolerate any dissidents, right? You couldn't um, disagree with the party line. You certainly couldn't criticize the leader of the party, or else you would be pushed out. And the thing that made Romney interesting to me is that for a lot of his political career, he he found a way to be on the right side of the Republican base. Almost his entire, pursuit of the presidency in both 2008 and 2012 was a kind of dance to try to appease the right wing of the party. And they always viewed him with suspicion. Whether they were religious conservatives or kind of Tea Party libertarians, they viewed him with suspicion, and he was constantly trying to convince them that he was one of them. It was why he, for example, in 2012 accepted Donald Trump's endorsement at a big event in Las Vegas, which I was actually at as a reporter. He did all these things to try to convince them that they could support him. Um, and some of the things he regrets now, and some of the things he now acknowledges were things he didn't really believe in, and he talked himself into, positions that he would have to take, or certain people he would have to endorse. Um, and in this last chapter of his career, he basically decided to set aside all political considerations and do what he thought was right. He's always had this kind of very active conscience. He's always had this integrity, but he found ways sometimes to bracket it in pursuit of the presidency. In 2016, 2017, he basically decided, I'm not going to be president. And what's more important is speaking out and using the platform I have and the voice that I have as an elder statesman in this party to call out what I consider, these really dangerous and egregious ideas that are being promoted by Donald Trump, and the corruption and the latent authoritarianism and all these things that Romney has criticized Trump for. It's why he took those 2 votes to impeach Trump. In the first one, he was the only Republican to do so. But it was him following his conscience. And I think there's something kind of almost moving about that, right? Seeing a politician set aside political considerations, in fact, maybe even end his own political career by doing what he thought was right. It's pretty unusual, and it makes for kind of really interesting drama, which is kind of what the book is framed around. The last half of the book is really that story of how Romney went from leader of the party to pariah just by doing what he thought was right.
And that's the other tragedy reading this, and just to see how the Senate operates.
Hmm.
And he's very frank in his journals. I mean, he's really, I mean, he calls him out pretty good, and just shows how there's this public persona that many of the Republican senators have. And then there's their private, where most of them go, many of them, dozens, scores, would go to Mitt and say, I wish I could say the things you say, or I wish I had your constituency would enable me to be able to be more like Mitt. And then they'll say things to him in private, but then they would vote, and they just vote the party line.
Yeah.
And it's as a principled, I'd say I'm an old school principled conservative with a libertarian streak. Okay. And I just feel like, oh my gosh, like, it's just so political, no principles. It's just become this game. And I find it so tragic. The
Yeah.
party of Reagan and Lincoln, and this beautiful party, really, honestly, an honorable party, where it's just become all politics and no principle at all.
That was the thing that was most striking to Romney when he got to the Senate. Like he is an institutionalist at heart. Like he believes that these institutions like the Senate and the House and the White House, the Supreme Court are sacred, right? That these are the founding fathers knew what they were doing when they set up the government this way, and that these institutions should be treated with the utmost seriousness and respect. And he assumed that the Senate would be this great deliberative body that it had always been presented to him as, right? That he would get there and he'd find a bunch of serious minded, sober people who disagreed with each other, but did so in productive ways. And, were trying to address the big challenges that America faced. And what happened instead is that he found a lot of his colleagues on both sides of the aisle, but especially in the Republican Party during the Trump years, that everybody was just consumed with trying to get reelected all the time, right? And it's funny. A couple of the insights he had very early on were, a colleague pulled him aside and at one point early on in his tenure, and said, "Look, something you have to understand, Mitt, is that there are about 20 senators here who do all the work, and the other 80 are just along for the ride." And so that was kind of a shocking revelation to Mitt, and he decided early on that he wanted to be a workhorse. He wanted to be seen as somebody who was actually interested in passing legislation, regardless of who it meant working with. The other revelation was, and I think this was really kind of interesting to me as a reporter to help me understand these people that I'm covering. He said, my colleagues attach an enormous amount of psychic currency to their jobs. Like their positions and everything that comes with it, the staff and the office and the trappings and the prestige, like it is enormously important to most of the people in the Senate. And they, a lot of them are in their 60s, 70s, 80s. They've already had success earlier in life, and whether it's in business or law or academia or whatever. um but now they're at retirement age, and they're terrified of retirement. To them, the idea of losing their job, losing reelection, is almost akin to death. And when that's the kind of prevailing ethos in the Senate, you start to realize how people will do literally anything to hang on to their jobs, because losing their jobs, it feels like a life and death situation. And so over and over again, Romney was kind of depressed to see what his colleagues were willing to stoop to in order to hang on to their jobs.
And he does there's a certain point where he does understand, like when senators say, listen, I would vote a certain way, but I'm afraid for my family's life and my life.
You're right.
And Romney even says, like, yeah, he's paying $5,000 a day for security to protect his family. He recognizes most senators don't have that kind of money. So he also kind of could understand why at times they had to do it, if only just because they're afraid for their lives.
Well, I think this is something that changed even within the few years he's been in the Senate. When he first got to the Senate, his sense was that most of the Republicans that he knew who would come up to him in private and say, I agree with everything you say about Trump, but then publicly, support Trump, defend him, vote with him. Um, he assumed that those people were afraid of political backlash. They were afraid of losing their jobs. And I think that was the main calculation. But something happened in those few years he's been in the Senate. I think the defining moment was January 6th, when a angry mob stormed the Capitol, chanting to hang Mike Pence, and they had to be evacuated. And like after that, he told me more than one member of Congress, both of the House and the Senate, told him, I want to vote to impeach Trump the second time, right? In the second impeachment trial. But I'm too afraid for my family's safety, right? I'm afraid of what some deranged Trump supporter might do to my wife or kids. And yeah, I mean it's strange because he on the one hand was appalled by that, right? But on the other hand did understand it. As you said, he was personally after January 6th paying $5,000 a day for private security for his family and himself. And he knew that most members of Congress couldn't afford that. Um and he also knew that he himself was constantly thinking about threats of political violence in various scenarios. He talks about addressing the Utah Republican Convention. I think it was about a year after Trump had left office, maybe even less, a few months after. And he expected there to be booing, right? These are, Republican activists who did not like how he had treated Trump. But when he got up on the stage, the booing was so intense and the yelling and the hissing, it was so intense that he could barely talk. He could barely get through his speech. And he told me afterward that there were moments when he was up on that stage where he was wondering if anybody in the crowd had a gun. And to me, that illustrates one of the most dangerous aspects of this political moment that we're in, which is that, I don't know how long the American project can sustain itself when our political leaders are making decisions based on fear of physical violence from their constituents. I mean, that is a phenomenon we have not had to deal with very often in our country's history. But if that is going to be a constant, element of our political culture, I think it's really hard to imagine bringing our democracy back to a healthy place.
Yeah, I agree. And just folks, like I said, I don't like to get too political on my show, but you all know that one of the things of this channel is we're building bridges. And of course, you all know I just recently started the Utah Interfaith Forum YouTube channel, in which I want to try to facilitate dialogue amongst different groups, religious groups. And also, I've done some stuff on Israel. I'm talking to both Arabs and Jews with my Israeli stuff with the war. And I'm just trying to show that, we can have civil conversations with people that disagree with each other. And let me just tell, I've been on other podcasts and I've talked about this in the past. So I'm going to talk about it here on my channel for the first time. So around January of 2021 was when I was prepping to start up my channel. So my very first episode was in March of 2021. And I remember January 6th happened. And I was so angry at what I saw, because what I saw was a bunch of people holding crosses and Christian flags, storming the Capitol. And quite frankly, folks, I was pissed. I was pissed because those are my people, many of them. Matter of fact, a very prominent megachurch here just down the road from me, one of the assistant pastor's wives, was storming the Capitol. And I mean, and then was on the local news laughing about it, thinking how funny it was. And look, I found the behavior reprehensible, and I was just so disturbed by it, and that I almost decided not to do my Mormon book reviews channel, but I was going to do another channel for about 24 hours. I thought I'm not going to do any Mormon stuff. I'm going to go and start going after evangelicals that are bad actors. And then God went back to me and said, okay, Steve, okay, you stew for a little bit, but this, you're supposed to be doing this. So I was, okay, I'm going to do that. And it turns out there's other evangelicals that are doing a similar project. So I'll let them do that. But it was just devastating to me to see that, because I felt like I never really, let me put it this way. I live in a Christian community here in Florida. All right. In this Christian community, Benny Hinn got his start. Almost every major televangelist that you can imagine has come through here. All right. And I've been offered jobs by televangelists in the Chicagoland area. My sister worked for one of the largest Christian television stations in the country. So I'm very much in this world. And part of me was like, why? I didn't realize how bought in people were to Donald Trump until January 6th happened. Because I was like, oh, like in my mind, I thought, wink, wink, nod, nod. We know you have to say these things down, and you don't, but I didn't realize how much the evangelicals had drank the Kool-Aid in a way that I found shocking.
Mm-hmm.
I just was totally disconnected from that. And of course, I had just gotten back into faith. I was an atheist for like 12 years, so I was kind of disconnected from my community. And I tell people, I say, basically 20 plus years ago, I left evangelicalism behind. And then I left the evangelical village. And when I come back to the village is on fire. And so I didn't mean to get on my soapbox here, but man, it kills me, man, to see what's happened to my people. And I just thought, man, these people, if anybody needs Jesus more than anybody, it's the evangelicals.
Well, it's interesting that you talk about this because I've written for the last 8 years about the kind of Latter-day Saint relationship with the Trump era Republican Party, right? And it's been really interesting, just political phenomenon, but also a religious phenomenon. Like in 2016, there was a pretty dramatic Mormon exodus from the Republican Party. The Up until 2016, Mormons were actually, according to polls, the most reliable Republican religious group in the country. Um, and in 2016, I think the best data suggests that about 50% of Latter-day Saints voted for Donald Trump. It's typically closer to 70 or 80%. Um, and there are a bunch of reasons for that. There was revulsion at his treatment of women, his affairs, his the way that he talked about refugees and immigrants. The church itself had kind of put out a statement early on in the 2016 race, condemning his call to ban Muslims from immigrating to the country. So there were all kinds of indicators that Mormons were averse to Donald Trump and the Trumpification of the party. In 2020, Trump won over more Mormon voters. I think it was more closer to like 60%. Still under the typical Republican presidential candidate, but he was gaining support. Part of it was that there was no Evan McMullen in the race. There was no kind of conservative
Right.
independent candidate there, peeling off Mormon voters. But I'm very interested to see what happens in 2024. I think I'll write a piece about this soon. But my sense is that what's happening to Mormonism in the at this moment in politics is that American Mormons are getting less conservative, but Mormon conservatives are getting more kind of Trumpy, right? And so it's a fascinating split, and you see it generationally and in other places. But to me, I'm a journalist. I'm not a partisan. I don't, I think this country needs two healthy political parties. It needs a healthy conservative political party because, the reality is there needs to be an institution that channels the ideological beliefs of, half the country that also believes in the rule of law and democracy and the Constitution, right? Um, so I'm not here to say, Republicans are evil or anything like that. I don't believe that. What I do believe is that, the fear, and this is not just a Mormon or evangelical phenomenon, but I think there is a very strong temptation to prioritize your politics and your partisan tribe over your religious beliefs at this moment, when politics has become so all-consuming in our culture and our country that it's very easy to kind of forget what you read in the scriptures, forget what you're taught in church, and find a way to support and apologize for anything that your political tribe does. And I think that part of the way to reverse this kind of destructive cycle of partisanship that we're in, that Mitt Romney has encountered, that I write about throughout the book, is to kind of claw back your principles and ideals, and whether they're religious or not, and prioritize those over partisan politics. Because yeah, I mean, I've become somewhat cynical as a political journalist, but politicians are not the people. They're not your prophets. They should not be your moral exemplars. Now, I do believe that we should expect more from our politicians. We should expect them to be good people, but they should not be the ultimate moral authority in your life.
I there's so, of course we're limited on our time here, and of course we're two political geeks here talking about this kind of stuff. And I tell people, I say, first of all, I live in Florida. Most of my friends are Trump supporters. Most of my neighbors are Trump supporters, and I love them, and they're still my friends. See, this is the thing. I think this is important, that what's happened is that people literally will end friendships over who you voted for president. And it's like, I tell people, I said, listen, I didn't understand Trump when he first came onto the scene. I didn't get it, but I remember he has this knack, and it really struck me. He was being interviewed, and he goes and he says, "Yeah, I remember when Michael Jackson and Lisa Marie Presley got married. Okay, and they stayed at the presidential suite at the Trump Hotel. And I don't know what they say about Michael Jackson, but I'll tell you, they didn't leave that room the whole time they were doing the honeymoon." And it was that moment where I realized that Donald Trump simultaneously connects himself to Michael Jackson, Elvis Presley, Donald Trump. And then that's when it clicked for me. Donald Trump speaks American. He speaks like the guy who talks at the VFW Lodge. Yeah. See, I'm from blue collar Northwest Indiana. Okay. Which, by the way, is shifting. It's because the most Democrat county in the state of Indiana, Lake County, that's where I run for county commissioner. It's about to flip. And you have to understand that the state that Bill Clinton did the best in one of the best states he did in 92 and 96 was West Virginia. Well, guess what? It was the best state for Donald Trump, West Virginia. So we've seen a cultural shift happen. So we're literally millions of people who voted for Bill Clinton, millions of people who voted for Barack Obama, voted for Donald Trump. And I tell people, I said, listen, look, and again, let me just say this. The Democrat Party in the 1980s decided they're going to shift to be a corporate party, just like the Republicans. They get a blue dog Democrat, Bill Clinton, elected president, and they pass NAFTA, which on paper is good, right? Free trade. However, it decimated the industrial Midwest. I saw it saw it happening. Company towns shut down, and it devastated many, many of these areas. And next thing you know, these also become places where you have high suicide rates and high meth and all this stuff happening. I said, a lot of the Trump supporters out there who were loyal Democrats for decades, all right, Bill Clinton signed a treaty that essentially decimated the manufacturing here in this country, created these company towns that were devastated, no longer company towns. These are traumatized people. So I don't look at Trump supporters as being evil. I look at many of them as being traumatized people, and many of them were traumatized by the party that they had a lifelong relationship with. What do you say to that?
No, I think that's right. I mean, one thing I will say about Mitt Romney is that in our conversations about, Trumpism and this era of Republican politics, he could be incredibly judgmental of Republican leaders who he believed knew better and were going along with what Donald Trump was saying. He was obviously very judgmental of Donald Trump himself, who he believes is xenophobic, racist, misogynistic, all of it, right? But he always resisted being judgmental of the supporters of Donald Trump, right? And there were times where he would kind of lapse into, criticizing the supporters or voters and say, like, why, how can they possibly support this? But for the most part, he was resistant to it. And I would sometimes ask him questions to try to see what he thought of Trump supporters, right? And he was always resistant. And, you know, it's funny because obviously he has a reputation as being elitist and kind of, you know, detached from everyday Americans. But I think the lesson there was that, like, he doesn't really place the blame on voters for being kind of, you know, drawn to a charismatic, you know, demagogue, which is how he sees Donald Trump. Um, he places the blame on the leaders who know better, who are disingenuously pandering to those voters. You know, on one of the most powerful moments I think in his this last chapter of his career was on the night of January 6th. So this is after the mob had stormed the Capitol and then been cleared out and the Senate reconvened, right? And Mitt Romney had hoped that after everything that had happened, the senators that planned to object to the election were going to kind of drop the whole thing, right? Because look at what they had done. They didn't. They went forward with their plan. Romney was livid. And he got up to give his speech after Josh Hawley gave his. Josh Hawley was one of kind of the instigators of this effort to overturn the presidential election. And Romney, when he got up to speak, um, he immediately went after people like Josh Hawley and Ted Cruz, who were making the argument that the reason they were objecting to the certification of the presidential election was to pay respect to voters who believed that the election was rigged. And what Romney said was the way to show respect to these voters is to tell them the truth. And his voice kind of rose and he got loud and really angry, right? And that I think is that's there's a lot of wisdom there, because that I think is the truth that of this moment. Like, these voters, I think you're right, have been traumatized. They've been let down by both parties. They've been let down by the ruling class of our country. They've been let down by people in the media like me, you know, who ignore them and
Mhm.
caricature them
Yep.
and you know, write about them in ways that are often sneering
Yep.
and, you know, disrespectful. And like the way to r- help guide them toward healthy, you know, more healthy positions. Not, you know, that doesn't mean Republican or Democrat like positions, but just you know, help them to see the truth of what's going on in our country, you know, maybe kind of disabuse them of certain conspiracy theories or ideas that have been fed to them, is to tell them the truth, right? And the I think the great sin of the Trump era is the the wide scale lying to voters to keep them voting for them, right? The lies that are being told to get them to vote a certain way, to stay angry and resentful, instead of being focused on trying to make their lives better. And that to me as a political journalist is one of the most offensive things, because journalism at its best is rooted in truth. And frankly, as a Latter-day Saint, as a person of faith, it's also one of the most offensive things, because religion at its best is rooted in truth, is about truth, right? And I've, you know, lived my life in a way that I try to, in both my professional life and spiritual life, make it about the pursuit of truth. And so I think one of what offends me most about this moment in politics is how easily our political leaders feel you know, okay with lying to us. And I think that we should have a much lower tolerance for that kind of dishonesty in our politicians.
Well, McKay, I just want to say this was a wonderful conversation we had today. Um, the book is Romney, A Reckoning. It's fantastic, folks. And honestly, I think it's important, even if you don't like Mitt Romney, if you want to kind of get to know what makes him tick, and he does have an inner life, and I find him to be a very thoughtful person, who thinks like a statesman, which was what we need more of in this country. We thought we had some in the Senate, but there aren't a whole lot anymore. And I just feel really bad about what's happening to our country, because I love America. I love the Republican Party. I mean, that's my party I grew up in, and I feel bad about what's happening to our republic and our democracy. And so I just want us to, you know, like in the middle of the Book of Mormon, it talks about the anti-Nephi Lehis where they bury their weapons. I think,
Mhm.
folks, both sides, we need to bury our weapons and have no more matter of ites. And let's try to use the Book of Mormon can be a blueprint, if you will, as an evangelical saying this, of how we can bury our weapons and start talking to each other. And that's what we did today, McKay. I want to thank you for coming on today.
Hey, thank you for having me. This was a great conversation.
So folks, just remember, don't forget to like and subscribe. And then in the description, for those of you who'd like to financially support the channel, there are links in there, as well as our merch store, mormonbookreviews.com, where we have hot chocolate mugs and other gear. I want to thank you so much for watching, and I want to hear your comments, folks. I want to hear what you have to say about this conversation and what you thought about it. But remember, this is the most important thing, is this, folks. Remember, all the voices of the restoration will be heard here on Mormon Book Reviews.